Joining us now on Practical 365 is Dr. Alex Crowther, who is a cybersecurity specialist and was the tech keynote speaker. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thanks for inviting me.
So Paul's with us and has a lot of questions if you've seen his article recently. And before we begin, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a chance to introduce yourself to our listeners, especially some of those who might not know who you are.
So, as Steve said, I'm Alex Crowther. I've been in the national security game for some 40 plus years now. I've worked essentially all over the world, from muddy boots on the ground in places like Central America to the Pentagon and the State Department. I do a lot of international work. Currently, I am advising friendly ministries, cyber advising friendly ministries in Europe and Latin America, although I'm expanding to Asia. And so it's really wonderful to be collaborating with people. I do a lot of public speaking and publishing because I'm a true believer in cybersecurity, and where we as societies, when you have 98% internet penetration rate, our attack surface is so large that really we need to inform all of our populations. Anybody who's connected to the internet, anybody who's got a smartphone, needs to know about cybersecurity and cyber hygiene, and so I spend a lot of time doing that.
And you've got a background that predates cybersecurity. So in terms of the physical side of nation states attacking one another. So what's the best word for that? Is that physical war strategy? What do you call it these days?
So I started out as a young infantry officer in the Central American Civil Wars, the Indian Ridge Drug Wars, the demilitarized zone in Korea. I was in the Pentagon for 9/11. I did 2 tours in Iraq. And so I've done the kinetic side of things, but as I progressed along, I went higher and higher until the last half of my career. I was an advisor for very senior people at the Pentagon. I was a politico-military officer for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I ran the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau for Ambassador Crocker in Iraq during the surge. And I ended my career as a special assistant for the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe at NATO, and that's where I learned cyber from Ian West and the crew at NATO Cyber, and it was so fascinating that I just had to stay with it, and so I've been doing cyber now for some 13 years. I was at the National Defense University for 5 years in their think tank doing cyber. I taught graduate level cyber at Florida International University. And then, as I mentioned, I'm a cyber advisor for friendly ministries around the world today.
So before we get into the details, and I know, Paul, you've got some very good questions here. Who should be concerned? Because I know the answer is almost everybody, isn't it? As you say, my kids should be concerned about their identities being stolen, or for everything for that. But when we're talking about people who are looking after the IT systems, many of those are running in Azure or Microsoft 365. Microsoft do a lot, and this latest report obviously covers a lot of the things that Microsoft see. But should does everybody have a part to play?
Well, if you've got one of these, you've got a part to play, right? Because what happens is the bad guys seek the easiest vector or path in, right? And so it's like, this report talks about the Internet of Things. When we go buy a smart refrigerator, we say, I would like a refrigerator that tells me when I'm out of milk. What we don't say is, I would like a smart refrigerator that seamlessly integrates into my secure home network. So you end up with this vulnerability. You have a non-passworded refrigerator. You put your router's password into the refrigerator, and so they can break into your refrigerator and bang, they're in your router. Now they're in your everything that's connected to your Wi-Fi, your phone, your desktop, your printer, your television set. They're into everything. And so really it's cyber hygiene. I've got to say that Microsoft is definitely the appropriate organization to publish this kind of analysis because of the popularity of Microsoft as a platform. You know, we're moving to from 10 to 11, Office 365. You know, everybody I know operates those off of those platforms, not only here but around the world. And so that gives Microsoft a tremendous data pool for cybersecurity from which to draw on. And so that's why I'm really happy to see Microsoft publishing things like this that's really kind of a synthesis of all the information that they're getting so that we can push it out there and as a one-stop shop, hand it to our family members, partners, collaborators, whatever you want to call them, for them to get switched on to what the problems are.
Let's ease into this with, since you mentioned Microsoft's Digital Defense Report, which is kind of what we wanted to dig into today. Was there anything in the report that surprised you? Or did you look at it and go, yeah, this just sort of is an extrapolation of trends we've already seen? I know there were a few things that...
Well, Paul, that's a great question because literally it was all just more of the same, right? And essentially what's happening, the reason it's more of the same is because what they're doing is working, right? And so because we aren't stopping them, they're just doing more of it. You know, Willie Sutton, a famous American bank robber in the early 1900s, when they caught him, said, "Willie, why do you rob banks?" And he said, "Well, that's where the money is." So why do people use phishing? Because over 90% of successful cyber operations start with a phishing operation. And so they're not going to stop doing phishing when something is 90% effective. They're just going to do more of it. It's the same reason that their ransomware is picking up. They're changing the techniques. For instance, ransomware has expanded from just shaking people down for money to now serving as a platform for exfiltrating data, right? And so that's new, but it's only a variation on the ransomware theme. You know, we talk about the report talks in detail about nation state adversaries. And you know, it's the same ones, right? It's Russia, it's China, it's Iran, and it's North Korea. North Korea pays their national budget is paid for with cybercrime, right? And so they're just doing more of the same. You know, we're trying desperately to catch up. And I've got to say that the one nice thing that I liked about the report was not just here's all the negative parts and here's all the people that are operating against us, but they also talk about, and this is something I'd like to expand on later, collaboration, you know, public-private, collaboration within organizations, you know, IT and OT together. And then, of course, you know, I'm operating internationally where states are working together. You know, resilience works. This is one of the lessons that we've gotten out of Ukraine. One of the reasons that we're not seeing a lot of successful Russian cyber operations is much like Estonia after they were taken down in 2007, and they said, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And they don't have problems anymore because 100% of them practice cyber hygiene. One of the reasons that the Russians aren't doing well or that the Ukrainians are doing well is because of resilience. They brought in friends and partners starting in 2014, and they have learned. So resilience actually does work, as is pointed out in this report.
It's interesting you say that because one of the things that Microsoft chose to emphasize in this edition of the report a little bit more was sort of the return on mitigation, right? Which is a metric we don't usually hear a lot at the level of customers that Steve and I talk to. And their whole concept behind that is, okay, if you have $1 to spend on some kind of cyber risk mitigation, what's the most effective way for you to spend that dollar to get the biggest return? Do you think that Microsoft is on the right track by focusing on sort of coaching people toward spending their money on specific mitigations?
Sure. If cyber hygiene, and I noticed the report said 99% effective. I don't believe that. The Australian Signals Directorate says 80% effective. I've seen numbers anywhere from 80 to 90%. So proper cyber hygiene eliminates 80 to 90% of your problems. But that implies that 10 to 20% still get through, right? And so you've got to have and I noticed this report talked about detection. And so detection's absolutely vital because you can't mitigate if you don't detect it, right? You see all of these reports where, like the Office of Personnel Management, they figured out in 2015 that the Chinese had been in OPM since 2014 that they could prove, right? And so if you don't have any idea that they're operating in your networks, you can't mitigate and recover, right? And so I believe you do have to, to deal with that inevitable 10 to 20% that gets through past cyber hygiene. You've got to have detection so that you can mitigate.
That's a good point. You could make a case that, of course, because Microsoft will sell you every piece of the tool chain, including detection, including response services, so they'll rent out DART or their other security advisors. You could make an argument that they're spotlighting that because it's in their best interest. But if I'm understanding you, it's in your best interest as a consumer, as an enterprise, to have that capability, whether you get it from Microsoft or someplace else. It's not just Microsoft trying to peddle something, as they're often accused of. It's a legitimate requirement.
You have to have some combination of cyber hygiene plus detection, right? You got to have a plan, right? Because what do you do when you detect it? If you don't have a plan and you detect their cyber operations, do you just sit there and watch it? If you so the three things that I like to talk about are cyber hygiene, putting together a plan, and being able to detect their cyber operations, which then triggers your plan, and then you can go into the mitigation and recovery phases. But if you don't have a plan, if you don't have detection, you won't ever see it. If you don't have a plan, even if you do detect it, you won't know what to do. So it's really like a three-legged stool, right? All three together can give you resilience. But if you're missing any one of those legs of the stool, it kind of falls over.
It's a really good point, because that's basically what happened to MGM over the summer, right? They detected, and I put that in air quotes, they became aware that they had been attacked when the attacker came to them and said, we would like some money. And their plan was to scurry around and turn off a bunch of stuff that had not yet been impacted to keep it from being impacted, which, as far as I can tell, magnified the scope of the outages that they suffered far worse than it would have if they had already had a plan and had detected the incident on their own.
Yeah, you have to have a plan more than turn everything off, right? And that's not really a plan, because what a plan does is it gives you something to do, so you can change the cyber operation from you reacting to you being proactive. You can shape your activities. If you don't have a plan to execute all the way through recovery, if you don't have that plan, you're stuck in the react mode, and they have the initiative. And so the key thing is for you to get the initiative and shut them down.
And sometimes
go ahead, Steve.
So sometimes that it's not necessarily as hard to have a plan, especially if you outsource the plan. And I do work for a company that sells managed SOC service, but we don't sell a service or anything like that that's specific to this. But what I have seen with customers is it will be that part of their plan is to bring Deloitte or somebody like that in to manage this event that's happened. Not necessarily you've got to have a book that you pull out like a disaster recovery guide. Is that true across the industry and governments, that people can all outsource the plan, or where do they get that help from? Because I bet there's people listening thinking, well, where do I start?
But outsourcing the plan means you do it ahead of time, and Deloitte comes in and says, okay, this is what we're going to do, and gives you a playbook that you can execute, right? But calling Deloitte after you've been attacked, that's not
That's
right?
not necessarily, that's not what I meant, but
right.
yeah.
So you've got to know what you've got to do.
Yeah.
And Deloitte is brought in, like I'm brought in as a cyber advisor for Friendly Ministries to provide advice ahead of time and help them think through what are your crown jewels? What is it that you need to protect? What is it that they're coming after? How are you going to do that? And ask those difficult questions so that you can have a playbook so that when something happens, when ransomware happens, you go to tab B, ransomware, and you say, okay, these are the 5 things that we got to do, as opposed to the CISO running around just unplugging computers and hoping everything will be okay.
And do you find that people overestimate how they can do this? If I work with a large financial institution, I will see, or a big enterprise like that, I'll see there's often quite a maturity in that they know what they don't know. They know that actually we're not able to do this. But the smaller businesses, as you go to 10,000 or 5,000, they have smaller teams, often very confident in their abilities, far in excess of, big, large enterprise, even though it might be running the same stuff. Is that something you see, or how do you deal with that? Because we all overestimate our own abilities sometimes, don't we?
So one of the things that I do, my second cyber job, the state of Florida has decided that local level officials need access to cyber advising. And so through my affiliation with Florida International University in Miami, 1 week a month, I'm in Florida working with local level officials. So mayors, police departments, boards of education, election boards, hospitals, stuff like that. And so one thing that I've discovered is the reason that one thing I knew before, because I actually interviewed the deputy of the finance ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. He commented that financiers have been collaborating on security since the coffee shops of Amsterdam, which is a great point. Because it's very easy to quantify. If you don't do this, you're going to lose $1 billion, right? And so when you can clearly quantify what the danger is, the CEO, COO and CFO are more willing to support the CISO in his or her efforts. In other places, it's really hard. Airports, not so hard. Hey, if this goes wrong, airplanes fall out of the sky, people die. Parking garage, when somebody hits you, what happens? People can't park, people can't get their cars out. The mayor. Okay, when you get hit with ransomware, what's the threat? What do you lose? And in my discussions with these local level officials, the worst case that we got is your constituents are irritated and they don't vote you in the next electoral cycle. And that's not really a codification of what the threat is and what you're going to lose. And so the squishier the definition of what you're going to lose if things go bad, the less compelling your argument for hiring a CISO is. And so I'm noticing that with a lot of places, it's really hard to articulate until you lose money.
And just
right? Just
before I
but without that, it's hard.
Just before I hand back to Paul, I'm wondering whether you see something where IT departments, they don't know, because an IT department that might include the CISO. Over the last decades, people have wanted to bring the CISO, CIO onto boards or onto the exec level. Doesn't always happen, does it? But they don't necessarily know what the important data is, because they're very focused on running everything day to day, attempting to protect against things, trying to do the right thing. But if I was to ask many, of the mid-sized customers, actually even, some of the big government departments, where's your most important data? what's the thing that you need to protect against in case of a ransomware attack. You know, if you were going to use backup software or Microsoft 365 to get a write once copy of the data somewhere safe, and you had to pick what would then be restored first, many of them just don't know. Is that?
And that's one of the things that we talk about when we talk with local level officials is only you know what's important to you, right? And so part of your analysis is determining what's important to you, because you know he who defends everything defends nothing is a statement for a reason, right? And so you have to define what's important to you. Also, you need to figure out what kind of operations they're going to do against you and what they want, which may or may not be the same as what you want to protect. And so this is a level of analysis. It's not difficult, but it's time consuming, and it's hard to get everybody into the same room at the same time because everybody's super busy. You know, they don't have extra people laying around to do all this stuff. One thing that the Army does very well, I'm a retired Army colonel, started out in the infantry and then was a strategist. And so the Army actually has people that are planners, professional planners and professional strategists. And my job for the last half of my 30-year career was to answer questions. And when the admiral or the general or the ambassador says, hey, what do we do about this? Hey, what does this country think about this? I was paid to think about a solution and create it, because our senior leaders are so pressed for time that they just don't, even if they're of a strategic bent, they just don't have the time to think through this kind of stuff. But your typical town doesn't have people sitting around who are paid full time to think. And so it's very difficult to get everybody together in the same room and answer the question, what is important to us? How do we do this?
So is that the first thing that you would tell people? So, you know, we've got listeners out there that represent small to medium-sized companies, schools, small local government agencies, all the way up to, you know, Fortune 10. Let's stipulate the Fortune 10 guys already have a plan. It might not be a good plan, but they've got one, and they have funding, they have CISOs, they have executive support, they have all those things. Smaller customers, you know, there's no guarantee that they will. So if you were going to tell those smaller guys one thing that they should do first, what would you say that it ought to be?
Find a competent CIO.
Okay.
There are, and I use the phrase cyber charlatans out there, you know. Oh yeah, I can take down the grid in Moscow tomorrow. Or, oh yeah, I can guarantee you that the Chinese can't break into your system. Well, that's horse
So,
right? They can't guarantee anything.
So I don't interview many CISOs, but it's the same the same thing that goes with if they're not talking about how much they don't know, then you've probably got a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. As a matter of fact, I was in an organization once where 25% of our budget went to IT. And as I was sitting in a hotel room in Hamburg, Germany, trying to log on through the VPN and serially failing, you know, I found that quite irritating. And so there's a person who's a cyber charlatan. Give me all the money I demand and I can do anything. Well, no, they can't. Don't give them a blank check. You know, you have to ask questions. The CEO, COO, CFO have to ask tough questions of the CIO. And so it's hard to find the right CIO. And then once you find them, of course, you have to resource them. But you gotta find the right people, because they're the ones that have to ask the difficult question, like, what is it that we're protecting?
And I was wondering whether you could help sort of pull the veil back. And many of our listeners will, you know, I think everybody knows that there's a difference between population of a country and its government, right? But and I'm not going to say anything offensive here. So if you're listening in Russia, fantastic, you know, get out. No, I'm going to cut that. If you're listening in Russia, then obviously, you know, you may be running running your IT environment. Maybe you were moving to the cloud just like everybody else. But to say, as Brits or people in Western Europe, then there's two types of attack that we see, and I've had a customer, I even had a plumber come around the house, and the same thing had happened to the business they worked for. People who are not the Russian state attacking businesses, bringing them down, and seemingly completely, there's no way that anybody could do anything to get any kind of recompense to it. And these people apparently be posting on Instagram pictures of Lamborghinis and things like that. Obviously, if we take that the other way, there's people in the US who will be attacking for money, creating cyber attacks and so on. But there's a consequence, and the same with people in Britain as well. There's a route to justice, so it can be quite easy to conflate the two when you're thinking about the Russian state and then people who are professional cyber attackers, and then you read a lot about how these are just office buildings, somewhere outside of Moscow. What is the difference between the two when we're thinking about nation-state attackers and these the lawlessness of attackers from countries where it doesn't feel like many of the people who get attacked can get any kind of justice?
So it's really interesting when you peel the onion on how states develop cyber capability. When the U.S. wants more people, they build a reserve or National Guard base next to Microsoft and recruit people. The Chinese force organizations to host cyber militias. Researchers in the United States have identified 50 companies and universities that are forced to host these, and so the Chinese government will tell you, one of the things that you have to do for us is you must host a 100-person cyber militia, and oh, by the way, you get to pay them and you get to equip them, and when we call, they'll operate for us. The Russians have a very innovative approach. When you're a cyber criminal in Russia and you're caught, you can either go to jail or you can hack for the Russian government. And so when they want to expand their capability, they recruit all these cyber criminals, and so cyber criminals end up spending half their time hacking on behalf of the Russian state, and so when you have illegal hackers working for you, you protect them, right? And so this is why we have a hard time. So if you go to the Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Justice website, you'll see all sorts of data on cyber operators who have been indicted, including 16 Russian military intelligence officers for the 2016 election interference. And so they're indicted, but we can't get our hands on them. The U.S. government feels that this is the best they can do. They can't go into Russia and snatch these people. Although there was a case a couple of years ago where it actually worked. A Russian hacker went to Israel on vacation, and we had an Interpol warrant out for him, and the Israelis grabbed him. And then it was a three-way or a tug of war. The Russians tried to get him back, and we tried to get our hands on him. The Russians actually promised, oh, yeah, if you give him back to us, we'll send him to jail because he's a cyber criminal. Of course, nobody believed that. So interestingly enough, the Israelis ended up giving him to us, and he's in an American jail right now. So sometimes it works. But the Russians and the Chinese, they believe that our legal approach is flawed and designed to keep them down, and so they reject our legal frameworks. So they're happy to sign treaties and then violate them. So they really don't care that they're breaking the law because it's not their law, and so they're more than happy just to do all this stuff.
As you said at the beginning, why do people do this? Why do nations do this? It's profitable. And
Because it was.
for those who didn't hear your tech keynote, I guess this is kind of a good unified theme for us to wrap up on. You said something in the keynote that I thought was a unique way of phrasing it. You said that the instrumentalities or the means that countries have to exert their influence are three. They have embassies, they have tanks, and they have money. And if you can control the flow of money, pretty soon your opponent won't have any embassies or any tanks.
Exactly. The economy is the one ring to rule them all. And that's one of the things that I liked about this report was it talked about the confluence of cyber operations, intelligence, they say espionage, and influence operations. And so you're seeing a lot more cyber-enabled influence operations and cyber-enabled intelligence operations coming out of places like Russia and China today. The other thing that I wanted to focus on just for a moment was when they talked about we talked in passing about vulnerability in the Internet of Things, but the other thing was multi-factor authentication and MFA fatigue. And so part of the problem that we're having is, well, when you've got 100 people, a couple of percentage of them are either going to be computer illiterate or don't care or just really angry that they have to change their password yet again because somebody up in the C-suite decided to mess with them, not understanding that passwords are a very vulnerable part of the whole thing. And so fatigue, I'd say it's not. The report talks about MFA fatigue. I'd call it cyber hygiene fatigue, and people are just irritated by this. They're not switched on. They don't understand that cyber hygiene prevents 80 to 90% of your problems, and that cyber hygiene properly executed helps to protect your ecosystem. It's like putting on your seatbelt when you get into a car, right? And it takes years. In the 1960s, we didn't even have seatbelts in cars. But yet today, when people get in a car, they automatically put on their seatbelt. It's just like anti-smoking campaigns. And so this is just one of those things. Cyber hygiene requires constant reminding, not harping necessarily, but constant reminding on why this is important. Don't click on the link. And so it's really super important that everybody who's got one of these things understands cyber hygiene, and everybody that works at your company understands it. Because again, the bad guys are looking for the weakest link. They're looking for that person who's going to click on the link, and man, they're going to take advantage of it from there.
Well, there's a final takeaway, I guess, from that for listeners, where if you've set up stuff like conditional access and you put MFA in place, but you haven't yet seen Microsoft tightening up the security. So if Alex, you're on probably several Microsoft 365 tenants with the various universities, government agencies that you work for, most people will start to see confirmation for numbers and codes, things that mean that if people are just pressing, oh yes, it just pops up all the time, yes, each time. There's a Microsoft managed setting that people can switch on in the Entra ID portal that will allow Microsoft to push any of those advancements for you. So you effectively have MFA improvements switched on an ongoing basis. You've got to consider what the impact of that will be first. But if you're not already turning up all of those controls to make things not harder for your users, but make things easier for people to stay secure with, it's probably one way of putting it, then that can be a little companion to help you on your way.
Well, for those of us who do this for a living, it's kind of second nature. But for I was just at an international airport, and the one thing the senior leaders did say was everything that we said they have heard from their CIO and CISO, so that was good. But I got the guy who handled logistics was talking about baggage handlers and the fact that they either don't read their emails, or if they do, they're totally unsecure because tech is, like 1% of their job. And so it's kind of a sliding scale with people like us at this end, and I'm willing to do MFA for everything, and I'm willing to change my password every 90 days. I ended up getting a password manager, but I have a VPN. I have everything, and I buy the family plan, and I provide it for free for everybody in my family. But I'm at this end of the scale, right? But how many people are at this end of the scale? And when you only need a couple of people clicking on the link, there's enough people at this end of the scale who don't use tech every day and who don't understand the requirement, not because they're ignorant or not because they're stupid, but a certain level of ignorance. Nobody's taught them how to do it or taught them why it's important. Even more important is the why. And so you can have all of your bells and whistles to do automatic stuff, but if you don't get that 5% down here who doesn't work with tech all the time, then you're still gonna be vulnerable, and that's the hard part. And we can talk all day long, but when I go to an international airport, I don't talk to the baggage handlers, right? Because they're handling baggage. I'm talking to the senior people or the IT people, and so I don't have the chance to proselytize to them. But somebody's got to get to them, and it's hard, and that's where we're at in our societies today. All these people aren't digital natives yet, right? We've got another 30 years before everybody's going to be a digital native, and even digital natives don't understand this stuff. It's just like studying a language. How many people have studied their home language? A lot haven't, and so they don't understand the intricacies. And so this is the hard part: is getting to that last 5 to 10% and bringing them on board with cyber hygiene.
I can't remember the last time we had a guest when I learned or thought as much about what we talked about. So, Alex, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us today. I hope everybody out there takes your advice and starts finding the things that they need to do and prioritizing them so that they're equipped with those 3 legs of the stool that you talked about.
Yeah,
very good.
Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Of course, Steve, Paul, thank you very much. Thanks to Rich as well for making all this happen. Anytime you guys need any help, just you know how to find me.
Cheers. Thank you.